Vladimir Putin went on live television and blamed a wall calendar. In a televised meeting on April 15th, the Russian president told his finance minister that the reason GDP just fell 1.8%, the reason construction, manufacturing, and industrial output all turned negative in the same quarter, was that January had 2 fewer working days than last year. Nabulina sat silent. Siluanov stared at the table. You're watching the moment a war economy runs out of excuses. We'll return to the man he wasn't looking at. Let's get the calendar line out of the way first. It's real. Putin said it on camera. He sat at the long Kremlin table, surrounded by the people who run the Russian economy, and explained away the first GDP contraction of his war by pointing at a work schedule. 2 fewer business days in January, 1 fewer in February. That, apparently, is the entire problem. Russian state television carried it without blinking. But here's the detail that matters. The calendar excuse didn't come from a junior aide. It came from the Economic Development Ministry itself, handed up the chain to Putin, who then repeated it in public and immediately rejected it as insufficient. That is not how a confident government operates. That is a commander asking his staff why the lines aren't moving forward and being told the weather is bad. You're looking at a war economy that crossed a line in April 2026. For 3 years, Moscow told the world its economy was stronger than Western sanctions. For 3 years, the numbers held. This quarter, they didn't. GDP is down. Oil revenue is gutted. The deficit is a hole. And somewhere in that room, 2 seats from Putin, sat the one person who warned this was coming 8 months before it did. Remember her. We'll return to her in the back half. So what actually happened in that meeting? On April 15, 2026, Vladimir Putin summoned his top economic officials to a televised session in the Kremlin. 5 people sat at the table. Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin, Finance Minister Anton Siluanov, Central Bank Governor Elvira Nabulina, Deputy Chief of Staff Maxim Oreshkin, Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak. Every name on that list runs a piece of the Russian economy. Putin opened the meeting with a single sentence that tells you everything. He said the trajectory of Russia's macroeconomic indicators was below expectations, below the forecasts of experts, below the forecasts of his own government, below the forecasts of the central bank he controls. The number on the table was 1.8%. That is how much Russian GDP fell year over year in January and February combined, according to the Economic Development Ministry. January came in at minus 2.1%. February came in at minus 1.5%. The ministry's first explanation was the calendar. January 2026 had 2 fewer working days than January 2025, and February had 1 fewer. Strip that out, they said, and growth was roughly flat. Putin didn't buy it. On camera, he told the room that calendar effects were objective but insufficient. He pointed directly at 3 sectors. Manufacturing was in the red. Industrial production overall was in the red. Construction, the backbone of domestic Russian activity, was in the red. These are not small corners of the economy. These are the load-bearing walls. Then he did something Russian presidents almost never do in public. He demanded answers, detailed reports, new proposals to restart growth, measures to support business. The televised scolding was engineered for maximum political signal. Every face in the room knew it would play on every Russian news bulletin by evening. What is the significance? For 3 years, the Kremlin's line was that Russia had absorbed every Western sanction. Growth hit 4.1% in 2023. Growth hit 4.9% in 2024. In 2025, the Kremlin predicted 3% for 2026 and called it a managed slowdown. 2 months into 2026, the economy was instead shrinking. The managed slowdown had flipped to an unmanaged contraction, the first since the 2022 invasion year. And the World Bank has already downgraded its 2026 forecast to 0.8%. The IMF revised up to 1.1% only because of the oil spike from the Iran war. Without that spike, the numbers would be worse. This is not collapse, let's be precise. This is a war economy hitting a fiscal ceiling on live television. So why did the numbers finally break now? 3 separate engines failed in the same quarter. Understanding each one is how you decode what happened. The first engine is oil. Russian oil and gas revenue fell 45% in the first quarter of 2026 compared with a year earlier. That is not a small wobble. The federal budget depends on hydrocarbon income for roughly 30 to 50% of total revenue, depending on the year. Cutting that in half is a direct hit to every other line item: pensions, regional subsidies, non-defense procurement, everything. Why did oil revenue fall while global prices rose? Because Russia couldn't get the oil to market. On April 1st, Ukrainian drones struck the export terminals at Ust-Luga and Primorsk on the Baltic coast. Both are among the largest oil and LNG shipping hubs Russia operates. Both went offline. Each day of disruption costs Moscow tens of millions of dollars in lost revenue. This is the attrition economics of a weapon that costs under $2,000 per unit, knocking out infrastructure that takes decades to build. The second engine is labor, and this is the one Nabulina has been warning about for 8 months. Russia's official unemployment rate is 2.1%. Putin cited the number with pride. But 2.1% is not success. 2.1% is a labor vacuum. Consider the math. The war has mobilized roughly 420,000 new contract soldiers a year. Defense industry employment has grown from about 1,400 firms in 2022 to more than 4,000 in 2025, absorbing roughly 4.5 million workers. Between 600,000 and 1 million Russians emigrated after 2022. Roughly 1 million Russian troops have been killed or wounded. The men who used to build apartment blocks and assemble trucks are now either in Ukraine, in a munitions plant, or in Belgrade. That is why 2.1% unemployment is not a healthy economy. It is an economy that has run out of people. The third engine is the interest rate. To fight inflation that still runs near 10%, the Bank of Russia pushed its key rate to 21% in 2024 and currently holds it at 16%. That crushed civilian investment. Corporate loans became unaffordable. Mortgage demand froze. Business groups, construction firms, and even Sergei Chemezov of state defense giant Rostec have openly called the policy unsustainable. 3 engines, 3 different failure modes, 1 synchronized result. Oil revenue down, workers missing, credit strangled. That is why GDP turned negative in exactly this quarter and not 3 quarters ago. The significance is straightforward. Sanctions alone didn't do this. Ukrainian drones didn't do this alone. Tight money didn't do this alone. The 3 together are doing what Washington calls strategic pressure, and what Moscow still won't say out loud. Now let's examine who actually pays the bill for all of this. The first people paying are Russian industrial workers, and you can see it in the cars. KAMAZ, Russia's largest maker of heavy trucks, reported a $284 million loss from sales in 2025, compared with an $11.3 million profit the year before. In March 2026, the Russian rating agency ACRA downgraded KAMAZ's credit rating. Starting June 1st, KAMAZ will move to a 4-day work week for the second time in a year. Sales of heavy trucks across Russia fell roughly 40% in the first 2 months of 2026. The company's own management told investors it doesn't expect to turn a profit this year. Avtovaz, the maker of Lada, is sending its workforce home on so-called corporate leave in May, officially citing production line modernization. The real reason is warehouses full of unsold cars. In March, while the overall Russian new car market grew 31%, Lada sales fell 17.4%. The national champion became the only major brand that didn't participate in the recovery. Where did those buyers go? They went to FAW and Citrac, two Chinese truck manufacturers that together now controlled 21% of Russia's heavy-duty segment. They went to JAC, Dongfeng, and Foton, which together hold roughly 20% of the midweight segment. They went to localized Chinese brands like Haval and Tenet, which are eating Lada's lunch in the passenger market. China is not rescuing the Russian auto sector. China is replacing it. The second group paying are Russian home buyers, and you can see it in construction. Russia's 5 largest developers have now delayed completion on 12.7% of their projects, roughly 1.95 million square meters of housing. A year ago, that figure was 3.2%. Smaller developers have passed 20% in delays. By end of 2026, delayed housing projects may hit a historic high of 16.2 million square meters. Total housing completions are projected to fall 20% below the 2023 peak. The third group paying is the Russian Federal Treasury itself. Government spending jumped 17% in the first quarter of 2026, while non-oil revenue grew only 7%. The result? A budget deficit of 4.58 trillion rubles, or about $60.5 billion in a single quarter, already past the full-year target. The Kremlin plans to cut all non-essential civilian spending by 10% in 2026 to protect the defense line. And here is the line every American taxpayer should understand. That $60 billion hole in Russia's quarterly budget is comparable in magnitude to total U.S. appropriations for Ukraine aid since 2022. In other words, the pressure campaign is being paid back in rubles by the country it was designed to pressure. That is what deterrence looks like when it is working. Not bombs, balance sheets. The significance is blunt. Russia still pays for its army. Russia can no longer pay for much else. Turn your eyes for a moment to the coalition that made this possible. Russia's April contraction did not happen in a vacuum. 4 actors have spent 3 years tightening the same screw from 4 different directions, and the screw has finally caught. Start with Washington. Every major sanctions package since 2022 has been architected in the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control. The oil price cap was a U.S.-led G7 mechanism. The secondary sanctions regime on Chinese banks that touch Russian defense procurement is a U.S. framework. The semiconductor export controls that choke Russian drone production are enforced primarily through U.S. choke points on firms like ASML and TSMC. None of this is glamorous. All of it is why Kamaz can't source the chips to build a modern truck. Next is Brussels. The European Union now runs 17 sanctions packages, covering everything from frozen central bank reserves to banned imports of Russian steel, LNG, and diamonds. European buyers walked away from Russian pipeline gas permanently. In 2021, Russia supplied roughly 40% of Europe's natural gas. By 2026, that figure has collapsed to low single digits. The European market that bankrolled the Kremlin for 2 decades is gone and is not coming back. Next is Kyiv. The Ukrainian drone campaign is no longer tactical. It is strategic. Strikes on Ust-Luga and Primorsk on April 1st, repeat strikes on the Ryazan, Novoshakhtinsk, and Volgograd refineries throughout Q1. strikes on Black Sea Fleet support infrastructure. The Ukrainian GUR and HUR services have mapped the Russian energy export spine and are systematically breaking it one facility at a time. American and European intelligence inputs make those target packages possible. Ukrainian pilots fly them. Finally, a more uncomfortable actor, Beijing. China is rescuing Moscow on the surface, providing a buyer for discounted crude, a supplier for dual-use electronics, a diplomatic shield at the UN. But Chinese firms are also the ones hollowing out Russia's domestic industrial base. FAW, Sitrak, JAC, Dongfeng, Photon, Haval. Every Chinese brand replacing a Russian one is a long-term transfer of industrial sovereignty from Moscow to Beijing. The Kremlin is paying short-term rent to China in exchange for surrendering the industries that used to make it a great power. That is four actors: the US, the EU, Ukraine, and an ambiguous China, applying asymmetric, continuous pressure on different seams of the Russian economy. No single cut is fatal. Together, the cuts have produced a negative GDP print, a $60 billion deficit, and a televised meeting where Putin had no answer better than a calendar. The significance is the coalition itself. American strength in the post-1945 rules-based system is rarely a single weapon. It is a network, and the network is pulling. This is where the bill comes due. But the real story of that April 15th meeting is much deeper than a calendar excuse. It's about the person in that room Putin would not look at. Sitting 2 seats from him was Elvira Nabiullina. She has run the Bank of Russia for 13 years. She is widely regarded, in Washington, in Frankfurt, in the City of London, as the most capable technocrat in the Russian government. She tried to resign in 2022, immediately after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Putin refused her resignation. She has stayed at her post ever since. And for the past year, she has been telling Putin exactly what was coming. At the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in June 2025, Nabiullina said Russia's growth had been predicated on free labor resources, and those resources, in her words, had really been exhausted. A new model was needed. She was talking about the exact shortage that just broke the economy. One day after Putin's April 15th scolding, one single day, Nabiullina went in front of the Moscow Exchange Forum and said something no senior Russian official had ever said on record. She said Russia is facing a labor shortage for the first time in its modern history. Unprecedented, her word. She did not say the calendar. She said, the workers are gone. That is the detail Putin didn't want on camera. The person he hired, defended, and refused to let resign just gave the real diagnosis a news cycle after he gave the fake one. One of them is briefing the Kremlin. The other is briefing the world. 2 questions split the board. Will Putin replace her when her mandate expires later this year and risk signaling open weakness to global markets? Or will he keep her and keep the one honest voice in a room of nodding faces? Moscow cannot afford either answer. The math doesn't care what Putin says on camera. The math knows who's paying. Every empire learns the same lesson eventually. You can lie to a population for a long time. You cannot lie to a balance sheet. Do you think Putin will quietly let Nabiullina steer Russia through this downturn because no one else in the room has her credibility? Or will he replace her with a loyalist who tells him what he wants to hear and accept the ruble run that will follow? We want to read your call in the comments below. If you want more breakdowns like this one, where we trace the real financial plumbing of a war, the kind most news channels never touch, consider subscribing. We publish one of these every week. This is the War Bill. Every war has a bill. We show you who's paying. The math continues.